maybe Russell and Brian, if you could talk about that, or any of you could talk about how the market moves from rental and how you decide and how the authority decides that that's the right thing to do.
I think the transition from rental to condo is really a function of the market and the value of land. And where just a few years ago the land price around the city were favorable for building rentals. Developers were purchasing land. Given the high land values and construction costs, has really driven developers to building condominiums. Construction costs have skyrocketed in the past year, 2 years, as have land values. But I think with that opens up an opportunity with green development. I think there is much greater opportunity for residences where somebody's going to buy their home as opposed to lease their home. I think there's more interest in the systems in the building and the design of the building and the interest on the part of the purchaser to live in a green building.
I completely agree. In fact, a developer's decision to develop condos versus rentals is entirely a market-driven one, and one that is increasingly a very difficult problem to solve here in New York City, as well as nationwide, where we're confronted with tripling of land prices over the course of the last 18 months, and construction cost escalation to the tune of 75%. It's really making the production of reasonably priced rental housing here in New York City virtually impossible, and as a result, it's becoming increasingly an industry that can only produce luxury housing, very high-end, very expensive condominium for sale housing. So it is a challenge that we as an industry are facing. With respect to I think that with respect to environmentally branded housing, certainly our residents at Tribeca Green, all of the environmental sustainable scope has truly resonated with them from a marketing standpoint, and to the extent that there was for sale housing available that included that, which there are going to be a number of projects in the pipeline in Battery Park City and elsewhere in New York City that will include all that. There will be that product available for homeowners, but again, we're talking about, unfortunately, limited to the highest segment of the market.
I might explain specifically how we choose developers at Battery Park City. We have a competitive process. We are a public agency, and so we want to assure the public that whoever gets the privilege to build really is putting forth the best package for the public, because we're the stewards of public land. So what we've done is we had 3 criteria, and in the last several rounds of competition, we've had a rating system wherein 50% of a developer's bid is based on their financial offer, and you've heard them talk about how they need to price a condominium versus a rental just to get that 50% of the financial offer and to be competitive against the other bidders. 40% of the rating system is based on their green submission. And that's done so that a developer won't simply come to Battery Park City and say, I can pay the most for the land. 40% of the decision is based upon not only how well they'll meet our guidelines, but what they'll do to exceed them. We want them to bring new technologies, more improvements on technologies to us, things that sometimes we haven't even thought about, and push the envelope. And that's how each successive building is greener than the one before it. And then 10% of the remaining 10% of the rating system is devoted to design. And that might sound like a very small percentage for design, but the fact is they've got to build within our design guidelines. So they actually don't have that much flexibility in design to begin with. We're really dictating a fair amount to begin with. There's a lot that, like Raphael, can do, even going beyond our constraints. But we tend to put probably more constraints on than they would like sometimes. Just so that's fair. So that's what we do, to make sure that it's not just a financial decision. 40% of the decision is based on how well they push the green envelope.
Questions from the audience?
Yeah. As a follow-up to that, about 10 years ago, the design guidelines almost mandated, or it was very difficult to have curtain wall, a window wall on a brick building. And there was sort of an unspoken rule that had to be brick building. How has the Green Revolution had an effect on changing attitudes about design guidelines?
I'll speak to it from my experience. I think when Battery Park City Authority decided as an organization to really implement these green guidelines, they took that to heart through all of the different divisions of the authority. And I know working with the design department, if we could make an argument why it was a better building, they would be willing to listen in a nutshell. And many of the things that we proposed, which were variances from their typical guidelines, had to do largely with environmental strategies. And similarly, this last one, to propose a curtain wall with a terracotta tile, was a big part of the argument for that was that it's a hard-performing wall, and the authority was very, very sympathetic with that.
You mentioned something that in Soler you were working with some of the green sustainable design, and then you realized some of them work and some of them don't work. Could you explain on that and also say something about the green roof and how you have achieved it, and does it your expectation were realized or not?
The list of things that didn't work would be too long for this presentation. I'll mention a couple. Fuel cells are a technology that are fascinating, but it's very hard to make them work yet. Beyond strictly an issue of cost, part of it is fuel cells need to be running 24 hours a day because they don't work very efficiently if you're ramping them down and ramping them up again. So you have to have a base energy load that requires the full generation of power by a fuel cell. That makes some of the bigger units, which are commercially available, which are like 200 kW, too big for a residential unit. It doesn't need that power in the middle of the night. So, and you can't send it back to Con Ed, they don't want it. That may change someday, but right now they don't want it. So there was another issue of fuel cell. Even the fuel cell manufacturers themselves were telling us that the technology that was then currently used, the phosphoric acid technology, was being phased out, going to a protein exchange membrane system. But even that, they didn't have an insufficiently developed form to be used. Fuel cells then, at least as it stood at that time, and even when we researched it again more recently, you need to get at that. You have a big box, which is the size of almost the back of a semi-trailer. You need to be able to get at that every 5 years and pull out almost the entire guts of that, and all the whole membrane system, and replace it. And that's a hard thing to do because you want to embed this into a building or into a garage, and actually getting at that to replace these things is no small task. These are all things that we looked at and worked on, but the technology just wasn't suited to the buildings where it was at that point. We looked at a fascinating product for our building called Ice Stone, because it was being made here out in Brooklyn. It was made through some local development grants. It was a 90% recycled glass product, taking all of the recycled glass waste out of New York City, grinding it down to sort of microgranular size, where when you add a certain cementitious material, it can be really as solid as cement, and it really looks a lot like terrazzo does. We thought that's terrific, very durable, highly recycled. It's using New York City waste. What could be better than that? But it wasn't rated for exterior use. So we wanted to use it on the exterior, integrate it into the facade of the building. We couldn't get it rated for exterior use at that time. And they weren't close enough to production yet to be able to use it on the interior. So some of this is just where they are in the state of development.
Can I just say,
Sure, please.
Fox mentioned that product,
Yeah.
and they're going to be using it at the Bank of America.
Terrific. Now, we kept them sort of tabs on it because someday it'll be a great product to use. There were others as well. I think I'm probably not remembering all of them, but those I think are two good examples. There was a lot of research that went into it. We looked at bamboo flooring products. At that time, the bamboo flooring products were all based on, they depend on very strong adhesives to really keep the flooring product sort of intact. And the adhesives were formaldehyde-based binder systems. So you're adding the toxic chemicals in the form of the flooring product, whereas a standard kind of a standard flooring product that you could do more water-based and more friendly binding system. A lot of these things have been addressed, are being addressed. We've looked at some bamboo products recently which actually would comply. It's just where it was at the state of the industry at that time.
Sometimes the choice too is not just whether something can be done, but whether you are implementing a technology that others are likely to follow. We've had the point of view that it doesn't make sense to subsidize or demand something just for the sake of proving it can be done. It needs to. The end result has to be something that developers will look at and want to replicate elsewhere. A real good example of that, which we're wrestling with now, are wind turbines. On site 1617, it really was the developer's intent with our encouragement to put wind turbines on the roof to create a certain percentage of on-site power generation. And we ran into obstacles. We determined that because of the wind configuration, we would have to elevate them about 30 feet above the roof line, which added to the cost. And what happened was we ultimately came up with a cost per kilowatt hour that we felt was excessive. I think it was literally 30 or 40 times the cost of just buying power from Con Ed. So we looked at that and said, well, we could do the technology, but is anyone else likely to follow us? And we thought, well, not at this time, they're not. So we may well not do that. We could do it, but probably no one else would pick up on it.
And Letitia mentioned the Battery Park City Authority's website does have a section on lessons learned from the Solaire project, which is available for download or reviewing.
You mentioned the Green Roof too, and we're very happy with it. We have certainly learned some lessons about what survives up there and what doesn't, and we have revised the kind of planting program. But otherwise, we're very happy with it. I should say overall that the Solaire has also been heavily tested both during the design, construction, and now subsequent to the construction of it, so that we can get real performance data on the building and how it's really performed, because it's one thing to design it and simulate it, and it's another thing to actually measure how it's performed.
That's a good point. One thing I failed to mention is we were fortunate to qualify for the New York State Green Building Tax Credit, which was another major incentive set forth by the governor. And as part of the ongoing annual recertification, Solaire is required to go through recommissioning and testing in not every apartment, but in a certain percentage of apartments as they become available.
Jim and Brian, is the Tribeca Green an 80-20 building for affordable units?
It's actually a 95-5. It was developed. It was financed with Liberty bonds, which are municipally authorized financing, similar to the 80-20 program, where 5% of the units, it's at 17 in total, are made available at regulated rents to households with capped incomes, so that so people with certain income levels are welcome in the building.
And that's the same with the Rhodesian and the Solaire as well.
In view of the rise in land values over the last 18 months, is there any thought of converting the Solaire and Rhodesian to condos?
No. Both projects, we have long-term ownership strategy. Our partner is Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, who also takes a long-term view, and it's financed with Liberty bonds, long-term bond financing, so there's no thought or idea to do.
The same is true with Tribeca Green.
In terms of the actual operating data on the apartments, have you been able to collect data on people's electricity bills to actually assess the energy efficiency accomplishments related to the 30% goals?
Yes, well, actually, our residents achieve at least a minimum of 50% reduction over a typical apartment. And now I should qualify that. I mean, that is a great number. Some apartments, like 50 to 70% difference. But one major difference here, not to be misleading, is that in the Solaire and the Rhodesian, it's a central cooling system. So the chilled water is on the landlord's meter. The landlord is paying to create the chilled water, which is the main source of energy needed for cooling, where in a typical rental building, there's a through-the-wall unit and a compressor that's usually on the tenant's meter. But overall, if you summed up all of the loads of both landlord and tenant of the Solaire and compared it to a typical building, summing up the tenant's load plus a landlord load, the Solaire is at least 35% more efficient.
Can you speak a little bit about the premiums that you found when you first constructed the very first green building, and if you have since seen a reduction in those premiums in your construction costs as you've gone into your subsequent buildings and more of the green market has come into existence?
The green premiums in construction costs? Well, the first building, we had estimated at the time about a 17% premium. But also to qualify that, it always, when you compare a premium, it's really what are you comparing it to? You're comparing a building from a baseline rental building to a building like the Solaire that's really built in condominium quality. There's quite a big difference. Looking back, the cost to build a Solaire by today's dollars would be much cheaper than it would be to build the cheapest rental building, and so that also just really speaks to the long-term value. Costs are going up, and when you build in value at the time, anything we put into the Solaire is inexpensive by today's standards. Same with the Rhodesian. At the time, we thought it was a huge premium. In hindsight, any building, we just finished the design of a rental building for another client, and the cost of that rental building, which is a pretty simple downtown building, exceeded the cost of the Rhodesian by about $50 a square foot.
I think Russell's numbers are consistent with our experience with the trend when we bought out the construction cost for Tribeca Green. We felt that sort of compared to a non-green, similarly designed rental building, it was approximately 15 to 20% of the cost premium. And the biggest slice of that is as Russell alluded to earlier, is the air conditioning system that you implement and that you need to implement in the building in order to achieve the energy efficiency goals. And there's a big upfront cost premium in going from sort of the individual standalone compressor cooled air conditioning systems that you typically see in a rental building to a central plant generated cooling medium. I think that over time that spread has narrowed substantially, partially because of escalation in construction costs generally in the marketplace, but also because a lot of these systems, as they proliferate in the industry, have become more efficient in design and implementation, and as a result, I think that the premium has narrowed substantially. Even just taking air conditioning systems as a standalone item, I think that we're continuing to pursue a lot of these systems in our other buildings, and we're seeing the pricing, or at least the price premium, start to narrow.
I want to add one point to that because they've given some good figures there. But with a little bit, it's, I think, overly focused on the cost premium to build green versus not green puts the emphasis sometimes on the wrong issue. Because we have designed buildings which are significantly more expensive than the Solaire or the Tribeca Green, more under the heading of a high-end building or a luxury building. And at a certain point, you're building to a higher level of quality and a higher standard. I mean, I hate to talk too much about what a green strategy is versus a non-green strategy. I consider these all to be evolving standards of the profession and to be high-quality design. I don't think we're going to be talking about many of these issues 5 years from now. I think a lot of these things we're already starting to do as a matter of course, as just how buildings should be built, particularly in the residential market, which is changing much more dramatically than the commercial market. And in office buildings, the first time somebody built a 13-foot floor to floor instead of a 12-foot floor to floor, you ask what the premium is. Well, now, that same building is worth a lot more because it's just what the standard has evolved to. It's 13-foot became the standard. 12-foot is an old standard and is a less valuable building now because of the floor-to-floor heights you need to do indirect lighting, to do raised floors, whatever. So it I think is too narrow a focus on the issue of quality and value. I think it's a bigger picture that you have to draw to really think about these issues.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it sort of brings me back to ask Jim a question about sort of what does Battery Park City Authority do next, or how do you continue to lead, or do you just keep up? I mean everybody's talking about how do you keep up with this evolving standard, where technology keeps, or material manufacturer keeps raising the bar in what's possible, and the lessons learned can only be learned for a year or so, and then there's a new lesson to be learned and a new design dynamic. It's easy to lead when nobody's done it before, and to be a leader, but how do you keep up? How do you instill yourself in the process?
I think, in terms of Battery Park City, we only actually have one more site to develop, so at some point, relatively soon, others are going to have to follow the mantle because we're not going to be building any more high-rises or anything at all. But in terms of the cost, just let me speak to that for 1 minute. There is a little bit of a differential in the cost of building green at Battery Park City versus a LEED Gold. I mean, you can get a LEED Gold designation and not have to do some of the things that we would require. You don't have to build, you can get LEED Gold and not have a black water system, for example. So we've tried to go beyond the regular LEED standards. But, in terms of our mission, which is, again, nearly complete, although we will continue to promote our experience. I mean, we're doing a lot to make, and one of the great things I think that all these bills have done is agree to share their experiences. They haven't, when they come up with a technology that works or a way of doing things, they don't keep it to themselves. They very willingly share it with the world, which is a great thing. And we're going to continue to promote, the value of our experience. But clearly, if our final building is complete in, say, 4 years, which is a good estimate, the technology will very soon outstrip what we've done because it is moving very, very fast. A good example of the photovoltaics becoming incredibly more efficient. And as I mentioned earlier, we're hearing about these photovoltaics that move with the sun. So I don't think that we're going to have the opportunity to present new technologies. We will get a chance to improve upon the current ones at least one more time.
But also, clearly you've learned something about a process of working with developers and working with architects and engineers in order to raise the standard. In the same way that the U.S. Green Building Council is continuously developing and refining and specializing standards for certain building types and saying, how do we do more? So what about the process within government can you use in order to apply to others?
Well, what has happened, and I'm sure the Battery Park City experience has been part of that picture. New York City now has an ordinance or a law that says construction that is in any way subsidized by the city has to be green. And the governor, Governor Pataki, by executive order, is requiring that governmental buildings throughout the state now be built green. And there are discussions. I've heard legislators, I've heard some gubernatorial candidates talk about replicating New York City's law and saying that any building in New York which gets a state tax credit or a state subsidy or is on state land or in any way is helped by the state of New York, shall we build green? So, I don't know that any of those things would have happened if Battery Park City hadn't been the first to bring that process to the table.